All right, so before I get into the actual presentation that I wanted to do, first of all, it's great to be back. I was here last year really briefly because I'm a pastor and it was Easter week last year, and so I did a presentation and then had to run back home to get ready for things. But today I was able to be here all morning, which is great, so I'm so glad to be with you again. So let me give you the background behind what I'm going to walk you through. So I don't know, have any of you ever been to Interlochen, Michigan, especially the National Music Camp? No? You have? Okay. So my mom had been there in 1956, and I ended up there as a student, as a tuba player at the National Music Camp in 1979, and then I returned in 1981 to be on their summer staff just because I loved the place. And as a pastor, fast forward to 2012, I went on a sabbatical in 2012, and I wanted to take my family to some places from my past that I loved. And so one of the places we stopped was Interlochen, Michigan. And I had remembered when I was a student there in '79 that in the Giddings Concourse, this big long hallway that has all these display cases, there's all these historic instruments from the Greenleaf collection, which most of them come from the old C.G. Kahn Company. And one of the displays was a Raincatcher Sousaphone that had a plaque that said it was the original Sousaphone, and then it had some additional information on it. And so I told my family, hey, I want to go into that hallway and find that Sousaphone again. And when I did, it wasn't in the hallway. It was actually down in the basement in the storage area, and I met the guy who kind of oversees their collection. John Beery was his name. Had a great conversation with him. We started talking about the horn, and it became really clear that the history was probably mostly bogus for that horn. That was not the original Sousaphone. And because I'm a lifelong tuba player, that just piqued this curiosity in me about, I wonder what the history of the Sousaphone actually is. Like, which one is the original? And then, like, what do we know of its story? And so for the last, whatever that's been now, 13 or 14 years, that's what I've been just poking around on as a hobby. But I've gone pretty deep. I've published a bunch of articles on the Sousaphone as well as Sousaphone players. And this is an article that I published a couple of years ago in the ITA journal that kind of puts it all together in connection with Sousa, because as you can imagine by the name of the horn, Sousa is very much connected with this instrument. In fact, I was trying to think about this on my drive over this morning. I think it's one of only two instruments that have been named after a person. I think saxophone, obviously, Adolph Sax is connected with that, but Sousaphone is related to John Philip Sousa. So, what's that?
Heckelphone.
Heckelphone? I don't know a Heckelphone. What is a Heckelphone?
It's like a bass English horn.
Okay, cool. And Heckel was a dude?
Yeah, and he made, I don't want to get off.
Okay, well, anyway. All right, so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to read an abridged version of the article that kind of pulls out some of the fun highlights, and then if we have a few minutes at the end, if it raises any questions, we can jump in. So here we go. Today, the notion would probably be laughable, but in 1922, John Philip Sousa was dead serious when he contributed to a newspaper article titled "Sousaphone Seen as Possible Substitute for Upright Tuba," which suggested using the enormous circular shoulder-borne bass in orchestras and other professional ensembles. As the legendary bandmaster put it, and I quote, "It is my belief, when properly played," that's an important thing, "that the Sousaphone tone mingles with better effect with the tones of other instruments, string and brass, than is the case with the ordinary bass instruments." Interesting, huh? By that time, Sousa had an impressive battery of 5 Kahn Sousaphones in his touring concert band, an ensemble that was enjoying its 31st year of bringing great music to the people. However, the celebrated March King did not launch his band with a Sousaphone because that massive instrument did not exist in 1892. Rather, he began with a few of those standard upright tubas and quickly but reluctantly added a large Helican bass played by an unusually tall German immigrant, which set the stage for the creation of the Sousaphone. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So the story of the Sousaphone in Sousa's incredible band can be traced through 9 milestones that appear along a path that includes monsters, giants, an intruder, and more than one sudden death. So milestone number 1, Sousa tolerates the Helican. It was the sudden death of Patrick Sarsfield Gilmore just 2 days before the debut of Sousa's new Marine Band that set the stage for Sousa's rapid ascendancy as the greatest bandmaster in the country. Gilmore, whom Sousa deeply respected as the father of the concert band of America, was touring at that time with an ensemble of 100, promoted without argument as the greatest band in the world. The bass section was 8 strong, it's a lot of tubas, and included Herman Conrad, a recent immigrant from West Prussia who was recruited by Gilmore out of Detroit, Michigan in mid-1888. Conrad was a mere 21 years old when Gilmore came calling, but he was a towering figure standing somewhere around 6.5 feet tall, which is really tall for that time period. Sousa inherited both Conrad and his monster Helicon in early 1893, about 5 months after the death of Gilmore, when the young giant, along with 12 other of Gilmore's men, gladly joined the newly formed band. But Sousa was almost certainly conflicted when Conrad joined, as he was not a fan of the Helicon tuba, given that it did not produce the bass sound that he desired in his band. But that was the type of bass that Conrad brought with him from Gilmore's band, and so the bandmaster tolerated it for a few years. However, Sousa had a plan to eventually eliminate that horn. He had pitched an idea to J.W. Pepper back in 1892, shortly before he launched his civilian band that would lead to the bass sound that he was seeking. And that brings us to milestone number 2. Pepper modifies the monster. Here is Sousa's own account of the horn's origin, shared with a reporter in 1922 in a rather obscure paper, the Christian Science Monitor. This is where it shows up. Here's what he wrote. The sousaphone received its name through a suggestion made by me to J.W. Pepper, the instrument manufacturer of Philadelphia, fully 30-odd years ago. At that time, the United States Marine Band of Washington, D.C., of which I was conductor, used a double B-flat bass tuba of circular form known as a Helicon. It was all right enough for street parade work, but its tone was apt to shoot ahead too prominently and explosively to suit me for concert purposes. So I spoke to Mr. Pepper relative to constructing a bass instrument in which the bell would turn upward and be adjustable to be used for concert purposes. So he built one, and grateful to me for the suggestion, called it a sousaphone. Now, it took over 3 years for Pepper to create that instrument, but in late 1895, the bandmaster finally had the preferred centerpiece for his bass section. A modified 3-valve Helicon with a beautifully engraved 24-inch diameter upright bell and an overall weight of 25 pounds. And just a quick side note here. So this is obviously me playing that horn back in 2015 in a concert with my community band. It is the exact horn that made its debut in 1895. There is a connection, though, with the Ringgold band that I know the guys in the back know. We talked about this earlier. So John Bailey, who used to play in the tuba section here, went to Renninger's Flea Market on a Sunday afternoon back in 1973 and saw hanging from the rafters from some binder twine an old dusty and tarnished rain catcher. And so he bought it for $50. Took it home, and then it just sort of sat there for a while. At one point, he polished it up, saw that there was engravings on the bell that had Sousa, and realized he had something pretty special, but then it still just sat there. And then fast forward to the 90s, he ended up selling it to the J.W. Pepper Company, and that's where it's been ever since, in Exton, PA. They didn't know what they had, though. And so I have done a lot of work with them to help them kind of understand the history of this treasure. All right, here we go. While it's unclear whether the new instrument went on tour with Sousa in the year that it was created, Conrad definitely played the Pepper sousaphone in the band's 90-day cross-country tour in early 1896. Performing 142 concerts in 89 different cities, both Sousa and his strange new horn were a big hit, according to the press. Now, at that point, we would expect a steady stream of references to Pepper's sousaphone in Sousa's band, but curiously, there appear to be none after that tour. The prototype seems to have just quietly disappeared, and Pepper never built another sousaphone. Milestone number 3. Con improves the design. What we do find at the beginning of 1898 in the Music Trade Review is the following introduction to the sousaphone, as if that instrument had never been seen before. Here's what it says. In honor of John Philip Sousa, the great bandmaster, C.G. Conn has made a new circular double B-flat bass which he has entitled the Sousaphone. It will be a feature in Sousa's band during the forthcoming European tour. So at some point in the 2 years following the creation of Pepper's Sousaphone, Sousa shifted his instrumental allegiance to Kahn, who was already working, by the way, with some other well-known bandmasters in creating huge bass horns. He did one for Frederick Innes, and he built one for Brooke as well, in Brooke's Chicago Marine Band. But whether Sousa requested it or Kahn took the initiative, by late 1897, Kahn's young craftsman who worked on the big horns, his name was Ted Pounder, had fashioned a beautiful double B-flat, 4-valve wonder monster sousaphone with a bell diameter of 26 inches, so even bigger, and of course it was 4-valve instead of 3, and a weight of 33 pounds, so even more heavy. And it won the hearts of both Sousa and Conrad. Now, while Kahn was surely pleased with his prototype, having proudly emblazoned the word Sousa on the bell, he had Pounder rework the valve cluster within a year, creating a second version. And then by 1903, Kahn had him tinker with the design yet again, creating a third version. And that version elicited great acclaim by a German reporter during the European tour of 1903. So again, Europe had never seen one of these, just like most people in America had never seen this thing called a sousaphone. Here's what the reporter wrote, translated from the German. "Very conspicuous is the softness of the brass instruments, especially of the tubas, to say nothing of the really carrying away effect of a certain bass tuba called sousaphone, which produces an astonishing effect in the contra-octave tones." While Conrad surely enjoyed such praise for his playing, he was at times reminded of the burden that he shouldered literally. For example, on the tour in 1903, after a late-night concert in Warwick, England, the freezing rain had forced the band members to walk the 3 miles back to their hotel because their carts pulled by horses and stuff, it wasn't going to work. So one reporter noted that, quote, "The player of the large brass instruments, which they call the sousaphone," and just think rain catcher at this point, like literally, "was unlucky enough to miss the instrument carts and so had to carry it all the way." And here's what Conrad is quoted as saying. "It weighs 33 pounds, but I guess it weighed 333 before I got to the hotel." That tour, though, ended up being Conrad's last. Presumably not because of that episode, but it just coincidentally. So milestone number 4, one giant follows another. After 11 years with Sousa, averaging, listen to this, 264 days on the road and 526 concerts each year. That was the average for Conrad. Herman Conrad, that giant, nearly 7 feet tall, was ready to exit the whirlwind of touring. While he helped Arthur Pryor launch his new band that fall in 1903, Conrad's main work post-Sousa was as a founding member of the Victor Orchestra for the Victor Talking Machine Company in 1906. But once Conrad left the band in 1903, Sousa wasted no time in finding a worthy replacement for the centerpiece of his bass section. His name was John Welch Richardson, and he went by Jack, and he was the same height as Conrad, so again, 6.5 feet tall, and he played the sousaphone in Sousa's band for a combined 22 years, which is the longest tenure of any tuba player in the Sousa band history. And I might add, he was born in Akron, Pennsylvania, in Lancaster County, right over there. And he's buried in Brownstown, also right next door to Akron. Okay, I just finished an article on him that came out in the current ITEA journal because I was fascinated with him. Even located his great nephew who lives in Harrisburg, who gave me his mouthpiece, which has a JR stamped on it and other things. It was really cool. All right, milestone number 5. Shorty circles the globe. Almost 7 years after Richardson joined Sousa's band, this would have been late 1910, the world-renowned bandmaster finalized all the arrangements for what was called a world tour, although the band made only a handful of stops in foreign lands, and only English-speaking ones at that. The British Isles, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and then Western Canada. Herbert Clark, Sousa's longtime cornet soloist, summed up the 352-day adventure this way, quote, "This world's tour was an opportunity for each one of us that only happens once in a lifetime. And we all came home in the best of health with an experience that will never be forgotten." Richardson, strangely though, was not part of that experience. So that got me thinking, like, why did Sousa's star bass player choose not to go? And we just don't know because he didn't tell us. But whatever the reason, Sousa's towering tubist remained in New York City that year, playing on recordings for the U.S. Phonograph Company, which is based in Cleveland, Ohio at that time. So, with his iconic Sousaphone post now vacant, Sousa recruited New York theater bassist Arthur Griswold to fill it for the tour. Griswold was called Shorty by fellow band members because he was only 6 feet 2 inches tall. 4 inches shorter than either Conrad or Richardson. He was also a bit of a character by all accounts. For example, only 3 weeks into the tour, saxophonist Albert Knecht noted in his diary, and Albert made a whole diary of that entire world's tour, he quotes this: "Ed Clark, our manager, held back our salaries, giving for his reason that some of the men on board were playing dice. We will shortly have a Sunday school band here, although it will be a hard proposition for Clark with men like Griswold to reform." But Griswold was no joke when it came to playing his horn, described by an intrigued Australian reporter as a big brass instrument with a funnel like a locomotive. Of course, wrangling such a beast for rehearsals on board ship during turbulent seas proved perilous. One of the band members wrote this in his diary: "Imagine the difficulty in trying to play an instrument with the ship pitching and tossing to such an extent that it was almost impossible to stay seated. And imagine holding a 33-pound sousaphone at the same time." Ultimately, Shorty's time with the band was, well, short. Thank you. He was the first to circle the globe with the sousaphone, but at the end of the tour, he went back to his theater work in New York City, and when Sousa regrouped for his 1912 tour, which launched on August 16th, Richardson was back at his post. Which brings us to milestone 6, adding a second sousaphone. 3 years later, Sousa decided to give his beloved giant a partner, shifting from one sousaphone being the centerpiece of the bass section to having 2 serve as kind of like bookends. What prompted the addition is not known, but it may have been the availability of an impressive young musician named John Kuhn. For the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, 33-year-old Kuhn joined Sousa's band wielding a smaller 3-valve Conn B-flat sousaphone. Kuhn, however, left the band later that year, allowing Oscar Cott to take his place on the second bighorn, and then Richardson left in early 1918, heading to the backwoods of Ontario, of all places, to join the Anglo-Canadian Leather Company band. Then, shortly after that, Cott joined Richardson in Ontario in that band. And so for 1919, which let me give a side note for a second. Timothy, you had a picture in your presentation from 1919, an outdoor concert with Sousa's band. Look closely, Kuhn is playing a solo in that photo. You see him standing and Sousa conducting him. Kuhn was an amazing tuba player. All right, where was I there? So in 1919, so he goes back, Sousa brings Kuhn back to the band, along with this guy named William Webster, and they were claimed to be, and here was the press notice, claimed to be, quote, 2 of the largest band men in America. Which to this day, people think that if you play the sousaphone, you have to be this gigantic human being. But back then, they had fun with it. The reporter went on to say, "It is said that they combine physical bulk and musician ability in equal parts. These qualifications being, it is declared absolutely essential for the services required. They will play the 2 sousaphones, which are important instruments in the makeup of the band." Which brings us to milestone number 7, going with all sousaphones. So for the 1921 tour, it appears that Sousa recruited Edward Brandt on the 4-valve and Daniel Markert on the 3-valve to fill the 2 sousaphone posts. Now, Brandt was 30 and listed as tall, but Markert was 55 with a height of only 5 feet 7 inches. So young giants, it seems, were no longer required. 18-year-old tuba prodigy William Bell was also new to the bass section that year. If you know your tuba history, nobody's no more important than Bill Bell. All right, but that September, toward the end of the 1921 tour, we encounter something that is either a typo in a newspaper report or a sign of things to come. In describing a thoroughly delightful Sousa number titled "Showing Off Before Company," which was referenced earlier, which briefly highlights each of the instruments in the ensemble. The article states that the performance featured, quote, 5 of the ponderous-looking sousaphones peculiar to the band. In the famous basso profundo drinking song, melodious, but in sentiment, something of a shock to prohibition nerves. Which a few of you caught the dry humor there. That's what the guy was writing about. So 5 sousaphones now. Indeed, it appears that Sousa had already formed what we clearly see in the 21 to 22 tour, which is a bass section that consisted of all sousaphones now. Something that he maintained all the way to the end of the band in 1931-32. Which brings us to milestone number 8. The sousaphone crisis of 1921 to 22. The 1920s were clearly the heyday for sousaphones, with these instruments showing up in all kinds of bands. Typically, though, in the bell front design, which was introduced by Kahn back in 1908. Now think about that. That's the only sousaphone we know. In fact, I saw a bunch of pictures of the Reading band with lots of sousaphones in them, and they're all forward-facing bells. But that was a latecomer. That was 10 years or more after the original sousaphone. The original sousaphone bell goes straight up, which is why it's called a rain catcher, popularly. Okay? So as a result of the rising popularity of this model, instrument companies struggled to keep up with a barrage of orders. In mid-1922, J.F. Boyer, secretary of the C.G. Kahn Limited Company, who worked closely with J. Sims, Sousa's personnel manager, frankly admitted to Sims that, quote, sousaphones are scarce and greatly in demand. And Sousa felt the birth pangs of this scarcity 8 months earlier as he launched his 1921 to 22 tour. Failing to obtain the advertised 6 sousaphones that people were expecting, the bandmaster was forced to begin with the tour with only 4 in the section, and the 5th one secured along the way was an intruder, an unwelcome bell front horn, which created the same issue that Sousa disliked about the Helican tuba. So there it is, that's Earl Field. By the way, side note, that horn and that player, so the tour started in New York, and when it got to Seattle, remember, he wanted 6 sousaphones and he only had those 4. But there was a guy playing the sousaphone in the Seattle Symphony, Earl Field, playing that horn in the Seattle Symphony, and so he plucks him from the symphony and brings him on the rest of the tour. But he was going as fast as he could to get rid of that forward-facing bell horn. Okay? Now where was I there? Oh, yeah. So at the end of the tour, the upright bell horns were returned to Kahn, for as Boyer reminded Sims, quote, the sousaphones were to be held as our property, loaned to the band. But that allowed Sousa to request enough bell-up sousaphones to be ready for his 1922 tour, including a second larger 4-valve horn, like the original one that Kahn made. The hope was to have 2 large horns and at least 3 smaller ones, but that grand plan began to fall apart almost immediately. What most frustrated Sousa was that what Boyer sheepishly admitted, quote, unfortunately, one of the 3 smaller sousaphones which you thought could be returned to you for your tour was sold by one of our salesmen who didn't know that all of those belonged to Sousa's band. And of course, accidents will happen in any concern, he said. And then 3 days later, Boyer added this, saying, quote, I am so sorry that we were unable to get another sousaphone onto you. I know that Mr. Sousa is very much put out about it, but it was just utterly impossible. Finally, 3 weeks later, when the band was a few days into its 36-day residency at Willow Grove, 4 Kahn sousaphones arrived in trunks, but not yet the new large one, because that was still in the plating room. And before the end of the 1922 tour, however, that spectacular new monster took its place next to the old large horn, and Sousa's sousaphone crisis was over. The bandmaster finally had his preferred quintet of sousaphones. So here's the 2 4-valves. So this is the original, you can see with a smaller diameter bell, and that was the new one with a much larger, and then 3 of the 3-valve smaller ones. Which brings us to the last one, milestone 9, the end of a sousaphone era. Richardson returned to Sousa's band in 1923, and that year also marked the one time a Sousa band sousaphonist died while on the road. Just 5 days into the 1923 to 24 tour, after finally finding a place to sleep that sweltering summer evening, 35-year-old Fred Grabner dropped dead. The report explained that, quote, there was not sufficient hotel accommodations for members of the band and the musicians were scurrying around for boarding places. It is believed that Grabner, in the intense heat, overexerted himself. Now, another side note just relating to the Armco band and Frank Simon. So they had to replace a sousaphonist really quick. And so Richardson was like, well, I know some good ones way up there in the backwoods of Ontario in that Anglo-Canadian Leather Company band. James Romero was one of them, who then was brought down to take Grabner's place. And Romero went on to be one of the mainstays in the Armco band. Anyway, fun little connections from today. So for the following 8 years, until Sousa's own sudden death in early 1932 after conducting this band, the bandmaster's sousaphone section varied in size from as many as 6 players, there's a picture of that, to as few as 3. But their horns always had the upright bells, even though Kahn ceased production on that outdated design back in 1926. As it was reported 8 years after Sousa's passing, quote, the modern bell front model sousaphone was not constructed prior to 1908. Sousa, however, steadfastly clung to the original upright bell, whether from musical judgment or from pure sentiment is not known, but in either case, he was amply justified. Amply justified indeed. Never again would the bass section of a world-class musical ensemble sound or look quite as impressive as Sousa's beloved sousaphones. So there you go. Any questions about any of that?
No, but if you go to the J.W. Pepper office in Exeter, you can everybody can see the original.
Yeah, they built a nice case for it a few years ago.
display
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, it's in their interior kind of atrium area, along with some other old Pepper instruments.
Didn't the Allentown band just do something about the sousaphone?
Yeah, I was there for that too. So yeah, so they featured in the foyer before they did this special kind of Sousa tribute concert. So yeah, so the Pepper Company had me stand there with it and answer questions, which was a lot of fun. So
Yeah, in
great.
2007, the Ringgold Band, in conjunction with the Berks County Historical Society, played a concert in the Abe Lincoln Hotel, and they had a dinner, same menu as was done in
Oh, wow.
1932 when Sousa passed away. And we played the same program that they played, although Sousa didn't direct it, and we actually had that horn on display.
Yeah.
And a couple of us got a chance to honk on it. It is awkward because the bell is up, and regular today's version is a little more balanced. You have to make sure you watch your balance with
yeah,
it.
yeah.
It's interesting.
And of course, these days, when people think of a sousaphone, they think of a marching band, and they assume it was invented to be a marching instrument, but it was the opposite. Sousa wanted like the best possible bass sound in his concert band, and that's what he came up with, right there.
Yeah,
All right.
He wanted that tuba sound.
Yeah, in fact, there's a quote about he wanted the sound to kind of envelop the band like the frosting on a cake, is the way he put it. All right, thank you guys very much.
Okay.